The temperature was 9 degrees below zero when Mason Rourke found the police cruiser upside down in a frozen creek. He almost drove past it. He should have driven past it. But the moment his headlights swept across the crumpled metal and the hand pressed against the cracked windshield, pale, trembling, still moving something in his chest, made the decision before his brain did. He stopped. And the moment he did, he couldn't know that 3 armed men were already watching him from the tree line. But the woman's inside that cruiser carried evidence that could bring down an entire county. That before sunrise, someone was going to die. If this kind of story grips you, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The fever broke 99 at midnight. By 2 in the morning, it touched 103. Mason Rourke sat at the edge of Eli's bed, with a damp cloth in his hand and a thermometer on the nightstand, and watched his son's chest rise and fall in that shallow, too-fast rhythm that no parent ever stops dreading. Eli's face was flushed the color of a bad sunburn. His lips were dry. The boy hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and when Mason had tried to get him to take water an hour ago, Eli had barely swallowed before turning away and drifting back under. The cabin's heating system worked fine. Mason had checked it twice. The wood stove was loaded. The temperature inside was 68 degrees. That was the problem. The problem was that the antibiotics ran out 2 days ago. Mason's set the thermometer down on the nightstand, next to the half-finished glass of water, and walked to the kitchen window. Outside Black Pine, Wyoming was nothing but white and dark and howling. The blizzard had started on Monday. This was Thursday, technically just after 2:30 in the morning. The county road that connected his property to the main highway had been impassable since Tuesday afternoon. He checked it himself, walked out to the end of his driveway in knee-high snow, and looked at the solid wall of drifted white that had buried the first 40 yards of road under 3 feet of packed ice and powder. His truck could handle it, probably. Ghost padded into the kitchen and sat beside him. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, lean, high-chested, with one ear that didn't quite stand straight after whatever had happened to it before Mason found him at a rural shelter 8 months ago. The shelter had listed him as aggressive, history unknown, not suitable for families. Mason had taken one look at the animal's eyes and seen something he recognized, and signed the papers before the attendant finished the sentence. Ghost pressed his nose against Mason's hand. "I know," Mason said. He looked back at the window. No. The wind was doing something violent to the pine trees at the edge of his property, bending them in angles they weren't meant to hold. The thermometer on the exterior wall read 9 below. He went back to Eli's room. The boy was awake, barely. "Right here. My head hurts." "I know, buddy. I'm going to fix that." Eli blinked at him. 7 years old, and even sick he had that expression, the one that asked questions he was too polite to ask out loud. He'd had it since he was 4, since his mother died. Like he'd learned early that some things didn't have answers, so you just looked at people and waited. Mason sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the back of his hand to Eli's forehead. The heat coming off the boy's skin was something you could feel from an inch away. "Are we going to go somewhere?" Eli asked. "Yeah. Is it far?" "Go back to sleep. Ghost's coming?" "Ghost is staying here with you." Eli considered this. Outside, the wind shook the cabin's north-facing wall. Something banged a shutter, loose for a month now, that Mason hadn't gotten around to fixing. "Okay," Eli said, and closed his eyes. Mason sat there another 30 seconds. Then he stood up, went to his bedroom, and started putting on clothes in the dark. The old mountain road was the only option. The county road was buried. The highway entrance was 6 miles in the wrong direction, and the bridge over Coldwater Creek had been closed since October, some kind of foundation inspection that never got resolved before the weather turned. The mountain road was technically a fire access route, gravel under normal conditions. It's mostly forgotten by everyone in Black Pine, except the people who'd lived here long enough to remember when it was the only road into town. Mason had driven it twice in daylight, never at night. In a blizzard. He'd loaded the truck, emergency kit, jumper cables, 2 wool blankets, a hand winch, flares, a bottle of water, and a thermos of coffee that was more habit than anything else. He checked his phone, no signal, same as it had been for 3 days. He left a handwritten note on the kitchen table for Eli, in the impossible event that Eli woke up before he got back. Went to town. Back before sunrise. Ghost knows where the dog food is. Eat his food. Dad, he thought about adding something else. He stood there with the pen in his hand for a few seconds. Then he folded the note and left it. Ghost watched him from the top of the stairs. Guard him, Mason said. The dog sat down, he understood. The first mile was the worst. The truck, a 9 F250 with winter tires and a plowman, never actually attached, pushed through the drifted sections by sheer momentum. Mason kept his speed low and his hands loose on the wheel, reading the road's surface by what the headlight showed him a second before the truck reached it. Ice patches looked different than packed snow. Compacted gravel showed through in darker strips. You had to read all of it simultaneously and make micro-corrections constantly, or you'd end up in a ditch before you registered that you were sliding. He'd learned to drive in conditions like this a long time ago. Different terrain, different stakes. Same principle. Slow is smooth, is fast. Fast as a coffin. The mountain road climbed after the first mile, switchbacking up through dense pine forest before leveling out across a high ridge. At the top, the wind hit the truck sideways hard enough to walk the rear tires 2 feet across the road. Mason corrected without thinking about it, kept moving. Coming down the other side, he had a 3-second view of the valley below Black Pine's lights, maybe 8 miles out, scattered and dimmed through the snowfall, and then the road curved back into the trees, and the view was gone. It was about 5 miles from town when the creek crossing came into view. The road dipped here, following a natural contour down to a concrete culvert bridge that spanned Ridgeline Creek. The creek itself was frozen, had been for weeks. Under normal conditions, the bridge was fine, 12 feet wide, 30 feet across. Tonight it looked different. Mason slowed the truck to a crawl, leaning forward slightly over the wheel. His headlights were cutting through blowing snow, and there was something wrong with the geometry at the bottom of the dip. The bridge railing on the right side was gone, just a ragged gap where the metal should have been. And in the creek bed itself, angled hard against the near bank, was something large and dark. He stopped the truck, sat there for a second. Then he grabbed his flashlight and got out. The cold hit him like a wall. Wind chill had to be pushing -25. He pulled his jacket collar up and moved forward, shining the light down the creek bank. The police cruiser had gone through the right railing and rolled. It was resting on its passenger side in the creek bed, the roof crushed slightly inward on the driver's side, front wheels still spinning. No, not spinning. The wind was moving them. The engine was off. One headlight still worked, pointing uselessly into the creek bank, illuminating nothing but frozen dirt and ice. Mason went down the bank. The footing was terrible, loose rock under ice, under snow, and he went down to one knee twice before reaching the bottom. He shone the light through the driver's window, which was the top surface now, and what he saw stopped him for a full second. Woman, uniform, blood on the left side of her face and neck, dark and already partially frozen at the edges. Her eyes were closed, but her left hand was pressed flat against the glass. Still moving, barely, he pulled the door handle. It moved an inch and stopped. He pulled harder. The door had deformed in the roll, the frame bent, the hinges stressed. He shifted his grip, planted one boot against the door frame for leverage, and hauled. Screamed, and the door came open. Cold air fell into the vehicle's interior. The woman flinched. Her eyes opened. She was conscious. Barely. She had a gash above her left ear that had bled significantly. The side of her face was a mask of dried and semi-dried blood. Her right arm was bent at an angle that wasn't natural. Shoulder, possibly dislocated rather than broken. Maybe, but he wasn't going to guess. Her breathing was fast and shallow, which could be shock or internal damage or both. Hey, Mason put his hand on her shoulder. Can you hear me? Her eyes found his face. Something moved behind them, processing, registering. Her voice was rough. Yeah, I hear you. I'm going to get you out. Push with your right arm. I know. A pause. My arm's wrong, I see it. He worked carefully, keeping her as still as possible. She was wearing body armor under her uniform jacket. The plate carrier added weight and changed the geometry of moving her through the door opening. She hissed in pain when he shifted her right side. She stopped, reset. Just keep going. It took 4 minutes to get her clear of the vehicle. He had her sitting against the creek bank. Then, his jacket draped over her shoulders, while he assessed. She was tracking better now. Eyes clearer, responses faster. Officer, he looked at her name tag Donovan. I'm Mason Rourke. I live up the mountain. I'm going to put you in my truck. Hospital's in Weston, she said. 22 miles. Road might not. I know that too. He looked at her. She tested her legs. Nodded once, unconvincingly. Okay, he said. Lean on me. Left side. Getting her up the bank took both of them working, and more than one moment where Mason wasn't sure the footing was going to hold. She was heavier than she looked with the armor on, and she had no useful strength in her right side. But she didn't complain, and she didn't quit, and when she slipped once and he caught her full weight, she got her feet back under her in 3 seconds and kept moving. He was 2 steps from the top of the bank when she grabbed his arm. Wait, he stopped. Her grip was strong for a woman in her condition. They're coming back. Her voice was barely above the wind now, but her eyes were clear, dead clear. The way someone's eyes get when they're saying the most important thing they know. They're coming back. You need to understand that. Who is? She looked at him. Then her eyes cut to the tree line on the far side of the road. Something moved between the pines. A shape. Dark. There and then not there, swallowed back by shadow and snowfall. Mason didn't turn his head. He'd learned a long time ago not to turn his head. He kept his gaze on Donovan and moved his hand slowly toward the flashlight in his jacket pocket, angling his body so whatever was watching them couldn't see what he was doing. How many? He said quietly. She blinked. Her eyes refocused on him. At least 3. He helped her the last 2 steps to the road surface. Got her to the truck, got the door open, and got her inside without rushing, without the kind of urgent movement that would telegraph to whoever was watching exactly how much he understood about the situation. He walked around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he glanced at the tree line. Just wind-bent pines and darkness and blowing snow. But the thing about good observation posts is that you don't see them. That's the whole point. He got in the truck, started the engine, and turned it around. The drive back up the mountain was not a good one. Claire Donovan, she told him her name during the first mile, offered it between slow, controlled breaths the way someone does when they're managing pain, consciously sat with his jacket over her shoulders, and her right arm stabilized against her body by the seatbelt and her own left hand. You need a hospital, Mason said. Can't. Her voice was clearer now than it had been at the creek. I called dispatch. That goes to the department. The department, she stopped. The department is compromised. He kept his eyes on the road. How compromised? A pause. Almost completely. He didn't say anything to that. Outside, the blizzard moved around them. The truck's headlights carved a thin tunnel through the white. He ran the possibilities in his head with the kind of quiet efficiency that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with training. If you burned out on every crisis, you ran dry before the crisis ended. Option 1. Weston Hospital. 22 miles. Road conditions unknown. If the department was watching for her, they'd have coverage on the hospital. Option 2. His cabin. Isolated. Defensible if it came to that. Coal supplies limited but present. Option 3. Wait for communications to restore. Contacts outside agencies directly. He did not have an option 3 timeline. He had a son with a high fever, and a compromised officer with a head wound, and at least 3 unknowns who had watched him pull her out of that creek. Cabin it is, he said. Donovan looked at him. You don't know what you're getting into, he said. But I've got a first aid kit and you've got a head wound. So let's table the full briefing for 10 minutes. She looked at him for another second. Then she turned back to the road and didn't argue. Ghost met them at the door. The dog came out of the dark interior of the cabin with his usual controlled focus, head low, ears up, reading the situation before committing to a response. Mason stepped inside first, which was the signal he'd trained into the animal. Clear. Ghost relaxed out of his alert posture. Then he saw Donovan. He stopped. The dog's entire body changed. Not aggression. Ghost's version of aggression was a cold, still, forward-leaning stillness that Mason had seen exactly twice in 8 months. This was different. This was recognition. Ghost took 2 steps toward Donovan with his nose working and then sat down directly in front of her and looked up at her face. Donovan went very still. Her good hand came up slowly, not reaching for the dog, just hovering. Ghost pressed his head into her palm. Oh, God, she said softly. My God. Mason watched her. Her eyes were wet. She turned her face away from him, but he could see the line of her jaw working, processing something that had hit her a lot harder than the head wound. This dog, he said. It wasn't a question. Once, small. His name's Ghost, Mason said. I know what his name is. Her voice had something raw in it now. He belonged to my husband. Eli was still asleep. Mason checked on him. First fever hadn't climbed further, still in the 103 range, bad but not yet critical. He refilled the water glass and left it. Then he set Donovan up in the kitchen, the warmest room in the cabin, and went to work. His first aid kit was more than the name suggested. He'd built it himself over 2 years, supplementing the basic components with supplies purchased legally through various channels. Suture kit, wound packing, Israeli bandages, a blood pressure cuff, Sam splints, pulse oximeter, oral antibiotics, the ones he'd originally bought for a wilderness scenario that never happened but might someday. He had training. He didn't advertise that either. The gash above her ear needed cleaning and closure. He did that with butterfly strips and surgical tape. Rather than sutures, the wound was long, but not particularly deep, and her pain response was controlled enough that he could work precisely. Her shoulder was dislocated. He told her what he was going to do, and she said just do it without looking at him, and when he introduced it, she'd one short, hard sound through her teeth, and then went quiet. He said, I noticed. He put her arm in an improvised sling, checked her pupils both equal and reactive, a good sign for the head injury. Did a quick neuro assessment, asking her date, location, her name. She answered all of it correctly, with the specific irritation of someone who knows exactly why they're being asked and resents the implication. The sheriff's department, he said while he taped the sling. She looked at him. You want to tell me what we're actually dealing with here? She did. It took 20 minutes. Her husband, Ryan Donovan, had been a canine handler. 18 months ago, he had been killed during what the department officially recorded as a narcotic sting, gone wrong crossfire, bad information, tragic outcome. The story had held because Gordon Voss, the county sheriff, was the one who delivered it. Respected 22-year veteran, the kind of man who showed up to every town council meeting and every local funeral. Ryan had found something. Evidence of a network, not just dirty deputies skimming from seizures, but a structured operation. Stolen narcotics rerouted through the county. Financial corruption reaching into municipal offices. Voss at the center of it. Ryan had come to Claire with what he'd found 5 days before he died. She'd told him to give it to the state agency directly, bypass the department entirely. He'd said he needed 2 more days to finish documenting it. He didn't get 2 more days. Ghost had been with him when it happened. Afterward, the dog had been taken into department custody and subsequently disappeared, transferred to another facility. The paperwork said, though the receiving facility had no record of him, except Mason had found him in a small county shelter 150 miles away, 8 months ago, listed as aggressive and abandoned. Donovan looked at Ghost while she finished the story. The dog was sitting 6 inches from her left knee, leaning slightly against her leg. I've been building a case since Ryan died, she said. Evidence. Documents, testimony from 2 deputies who came to me privately. She stopped. I had copies secured, encrypted drives. 1 set with a contact in Cheyenne, 1 set with a federal investigator I've been in touch with, and 1 set with me. Where my cruiser? A silence. The cruiser that's upside down in a creek, Mason said. The evidence compartment is waterproofed and fire-rated. Her voice was level. Standard department equipment. If the vehicle isn't moved, the compartment survives. It's rated to. She stopped. Ghost stood up. Every hair along the dog's spine rose in a single sharp ridge. He turned toward the cabin's front wall and went completely still, nose forward, and produced 1 low sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite anything else, just a sound that meant something is coming, and it is not something I trust. Mason was already moving to the window before the sound finished. The headlights came through the trees from the direction of the county road. 1 set of lights, 2, and then a 3rd. Donovan was on her feet. Her face had changed, all the injured softness gone, replaced by something flat and ready. How many exits? She said quietly. Front door, back door, 2 ground floor windows on the east wall, 1 in the kitchen. He was looking at the approaching lights. Basement access through the kitchen floor. Is your son? Upstairs. Center bedroom. You need to get him down. Yet. He watched the lights. They were moving slowly, racing up the driveway, taking their time. The way you move when you're establishing position, not when you're chasing. They're setting up. Donovan came to stand beside him. How do you know that? He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the lights. Because that's what I'd do, he said. 3 vehicles stopped 50 yards from the cabin. Engines idling. Headlights forward. Nobody got out immediately, which meant they were talking coordinating. Assigning positions. Maybe one of them was calling it in. Maybe not. One vehicle door opened. A man walked toward the cabin in the full beam of his own headlights, which meant he wanted to be seen, which meant he wasn't afraid of being seen. He was wearing a sheriff's department coat. No hat. Gray-haired. The kind of face that looked honest because it had so much practice at it. He knocked on the door. Mason looked at Donovan. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside the staircase, out of any sight line from the door. Ghost followed her and sat at her feet without being told. Mason rolled his shoulders once, put on the face he needed, the quiet, tired, slightly confused neighbor face, the harmless, single dad face he'd been wearing for 2 years in this town. He opened the door. The man on the porch smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, Mr. Rourke. Sorry to wake you at this hour. I'm Sheriff Gordon Voss. He held up one hand like it was a casual visit, and the 2 vehicles behind him didn't exist. We've got a deputy unaccounted for tonight. Roads are bad, as you know, and we're just checking properties along the mountain road, wondering if you might have seen anything on your way in or out this evening. Mason leaned against the doorframe. Haven't been out, he said. Voss looked at the truck in the driveway. The snow on its hood was gone melted by the engine heat, less than 2 hours old. He looked back at Mason. Funny, Voss said, and his smile didn't change at all. 'Cause it looks like somebody has. The 2 men looked at each other. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere behind Voss, a door opened on one of the vehicles. And Mason heard quiet, almost lost in the wind, not meant to carry this far, but carried anyway by some trick of the cold air and the tree line, the unmistakable sound of a rifle bolt being worked. Mason didn't move, not because he was frozen. 'Cause moving wrong, right now flinching, stepping back, showing the calculation happening behind his eyes, would tell Voss everything he needed to know. And Voss was already reading him. The sheriff's gaze had dropped to a truck for 2 full seconds and come back, and behind that practiced, reasonable smile was something that worked angles the way a card player works a table. So Mason stayed in the doorframe, arms loose, expression a degree or 2 past, not defensive, not aggressive, just a man who'd been woken up and was being mildly inconvenienced. Truck's been sitting there all day, Mason said. Hood runs hot. Always has. Voss tilted his head slightly, testing the answer. Looking for the seam. Engine heat doesn't usually melt a full inch of snow accumulation, he said pleasantly. From sittings, then maybe it was the wind. Maybe. Voss looked past Mason into the cabin interior, a casual sweep, practiced, the kind of look designed to appear casual while missing nothing. Mind if I come in? It's cold out here. My son's sick, Mason said. He's sleeping. I'd rather not. Won't take long. Voss was already moving forward slightly. Not a push, just the kind of gentle forward pressure that relies on social reflex, on the deeply conditioned human instinct to step back when someone steps toward you. Mason didn't step back. He filled the doorframe a fraction more completely, shifting his weight without making a production of it. And Voss stopped. The smile stayed on, but something behind it recalibrated. I appreciate what you're doing out here, Mason said. No, truly, if I see anything, I'll radio it in when the communications come back up. He met Voss's eyes. Hate to think of one of your people out there in this weather. A long pause. The wind pushed through the gap between them, cold enough to sting. We all do, Voss said finally. He held Mason's gaze for one more beat, the kind of beat that's a message, and then stepped back and nodded. Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Rourke. You stay warm now. He turned and walked back toward the vehicles. Mason stayed in the doorframe until Voss reached his cruiser and got in. He raised one hand in a neighborly acknowledgement to nobody in particular, and then stepped back inside and closed the door. He didn't lock it yet. Locking it would make a sound. He counted to 5. Then he moved away from the door and pressed himself against the wall beside the front window and looked out at an angle, keeping back from the glass. The three vehicles sat for 40 seconds without moving. One by one, they made slow three-point turns and drove back down the driveway toward the county road. Mason watched their taillights disappear into the snow and dark. He stood there for 30 more seconds. "They're not leaving," Donovan said from behind him. She'd stayed flat against the wall by the staircase. Her voice was quiet and certain. "No," he said. "They're not." He moved to the kitchen window and looked out at the tree line on the west side of the property. Nothing visible. But the tree line was 60 yards out, and the night was dark, and the snow was still coming down, and you could park a truck in those trees, and you wouldn't see it from the cabin until you were specifically looking for it, which he now was. He thought he could see the angular outline of a hood through the gap between two large pines. Hard to be certain. Could be a fallen snag. Could be a vehicle with its lights cut. He decided to operate as though it was a vehicle. "Okay," he said, coming back to the kitchen. "Tell me what you told the federal contact." Donovan was still on her feet, which he respected, and also thought was probably stupid given her shoulder. He pulled a chair out and put it in front of her without making it a request, and she sat in it after a moment's hesitation. "His name is Briggs. Special Agent, FBI Field Office out of Cheyenne. I've been in contact with him for 6 months, sending documents in pieces so no single transmission would flag if it was intercepted. He has enough to move, but she paused. "I've been waiting until I had the financial connection documented. The money trail is what ties Voss directly to the operation, rather than just to the deputies. The financial documentation is in your cruiser, on a drive in the evidence compartment." "Yes. Along with the rest of what you were carrying tonight." She looked at him. "How did you know I was carrying anything specific tonight?" "Because someone ran you off that road," Mason said. "That doesn't happen to a patrol officer on a routine shift. That happens when someone knows you're moving something they don't want moved." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I was transferring the drives to a secondary location. I'd been compromised. Somebody had accessed my apartment. I came home 2 nights ago, and everything looked fine, but it wasn't. Things were a quarter-inch off from where I'd left them. Small things. The kind of things you only notice if you've been trained to notice them. So you know Voss has people inside the county? I know he has people everywhere." She said it simply, without drama, which made it land harder than if she'd made it a speech. Mason thought about Eli upstairs, about the locked case in the back of his bedroom closet that he hadn't opened in 2 years, about the rifle bolt sound he'd heard through the wind. "Your evidence compartment," he said. "You said it's waterproofed. Fire rated. Is it cut resistant? It's rated against standard hand tools." "Yes." "You'd need—" She stopped, reading where the question was going. "You'd need something mechanical. An angle grinder, a Halligan bar and time, or department bolt cutters, the heavy kind. Can Voss access it without destroying the drives? Without the key, which is—" Her hand moved toward her jacket pocket out of reflex, and then stopped. "It was on my key ring, which was in the ignition." She said it flat, not like a defeat, just like a fact she was registering and filing away. Mason had worked with people who processed setbacks that way. He'd always found it either admirable or terrifying, and had never fully decided which. "Okay," he said. "So, we assume he'll have access to the compartment before morning, which means the drives in that compartment are the backup." She looked at him. "The primary set is with Briggs. He has enough without the financial documents. It's just a pause. It's just cleaner with them. Or necessary. A silence. Probably both," she said quietly. Ghost had been sitting between them during all of this, head turning slightly from one voice to the other, like he was following a conversation he'd heard before. He stood and walked to the back door of the kitchen and sat facing it. His ears came forward. Neither of them said anything. Mason moved to the back window, came at it from the side, slow, and looked out. The rear of the property was a 60-foot clearing that ended at the barn unused, the previous owners, and then more tree line beyond. The snow was coming down at an angle in the wind, which compromised visibility in both directions. He watched for 30 seconds. Movement. Left side of the barn, near the corner. One shape, dark against the weathered siding. Standing still, which was smart. Moving shapes are easier to pick up than stationary ones in poor visibility. But the shape was there, and it wasn't a fence post, and it wasn't a snow-laden branch, and it was wearing something that didn't quite match the barn. He checked the east-facing kitchen window. Tree line. Harder to see from this angle. He moved to the small utility room off the kitchen, where a narrow window faced east-northeast. Took a minute, let his eyes fully adjust past the interior light bleed. Between two spruce trees, the occasional glow of something not a light, exactly, but the reflection of ambient light off a surface that moved slightly. A lens, maybe, binoculars, a scope too. He came back to the kitchen. Ghost was still at the back door, ears still forward, but he hadn't escalated whatever he was. Tracking wasn't moving closer. Donovan read his face. How many? At least 2 on the perimeter. Probably more on the county roadside. He thought about it. 4 minimum. Probably 6. He wouldn't come with fewer than 8, she said. She stopped, seemed to choose her words. He doesn't underestimate. Whatever he appears to be, however casual he acts, he is not casual. He plans. He came up here personally, Mason said. That means he's not sure what he's dealing with. He wanted to assess. He has. And no, he has, she agreed. What Voss had assessed was a single man, 30s, quiet, lives alone with his kid and a dog, visible threat. Probably no weapons beyond a typical Wyoming household shotgun. The mountain road background implied some degree of rural capability, but nothing operational. Mason had given him nothing to worry about beyond the truck discrepancy, and he'd fielded that competently enough not to panic. Voss would be patient. He had position, numbers, and communications. Mason had a compromised officer, a feverish 7-year-old, and a dog. The smart play for Voss was to wait. Let the cold and the isolation do the psychological work. People in cabins at 3 in the morning with sick kids and no phone service, and armed men surrounding them, they make mistakes. They try to run, or they break down, or they do something that gives you a reason. Unless the person inside the cabin had spent years in situations where patience was the primary weapon on both sides. How's your head? Mason asked. Manageable. Your shoulder? Hurts. Can you function? She looked at him directly. What do you think I've been doing for the last 18 months? He almost said something to that, then didn't. He went to his bedroom, moved to the closet, and pushed aside the box of Eli's old winter clothing that sat in front of the locked case. The case was gray polymer, 4 feet long. He hadn't touched it in 2 years. He entered the combination by feel 6 digits he'd never written down anywhere and opened it. Inside, a Remington 870 in 0.12 gauge, with a tactical light and extended magazine, a Glock 19 holster, and 4 spare magazines, 200 rounds of 0.12 gauge, in a mix of buckshot and slug, 150 rounds of 9mm, a plate carrier, stripped of plates which were in a separate pouch beneath it. Vision monocular older model, Generation 2, not ideal but functional, a tourniquet, a cat, a combat application bandage, and a second complete trauma kit. A handheld radio analog, not digital, with a separate antenna that could reach state police frequencies. He looked at it for a moment. Then he started pulling what he needed. When he came back to the kitchen, Donovan's eyes went to the plate carrier on his arm, to the Glock in the holster, to the radio in his hand. She didn't say anything for a count of 3. Who are you? She said. A concerned neighbor. Try again. He set the radio on the table and started checking the Glock, dropped the magazine, racked the slide, inspect the chamber, reload. His hands moved through the sequence without thought, which is the only way it should ever be done. I spent 11 years in the Navy, he said. Last 7.5 in SEAL teams. East Coast based, multiple deployments. I separated 3 years ago. He seated the magazine and holstered the weapon. Advertise it. She watched him. Why not? Because in my experience, the moment people find out, they either want something from you or they're afraid of you. And I've got a 7-year-old to raise. So both of those things are inconvenient. She looked at the plate carrier, at the radio, at the methodical, unhurried way he was preparing, the absence of the tension that she would have expected in a civilian who'd just discovered armed men surrounding his house. Your hands are steady, she said. I know. Most people, what most people are like. He looked up from what he was doing. I'm not most people. That's relevant to tonight, so now you know. It's not a conversation I want to have again. Silence. Ghost had relaxed. Slightly ears, back to their normal position, the threat at the back door apparently holding position rather than advancing. Outside, the wind continued its work, pushing snow against the north-facing wall of the cabin in waves that sounded like slow static. The radio, Donovan said. Will it reach anyone? State police uses analog backup frequencies during weather events. They might have someone on channel. He picked it up. Might not. And if Voss has anyone monitoring, which he probably does, it tells him we're trying to communicate. That changes his calculus, meaning he moves faster. He might decide he can't wait. She absorbed this. He could see her building the same decision tree he was working through. She was good at it, he noted, better than most. She wasn't panicking, and she wasn't deferring. She was thinking. We need to be ready before he decides to move, she said. That's the idea. He went upstairs. Moving quietly, he opened Eli's door and stood in the doorway. His son was still asleep, curled on his left side, the blankets pulled up around his shoulders. His breathing was still too fast, but he wasn't in the thrashing, restless state that usually preceded a fever spike. Mason crossed to the bed, put his hand on Eli's forehead. Same heat as before, not climbing. He stood there for a few seconds. The room was at the front of the cabin, east-facing window. Good concealment from the county roads, but exposed to anyone who got close on the east perimeter. A good room to be in, if the situation deteriorated. He went to his own room next, which faced north and west. He moved the bed. Under the floorboards, accessible by removing 2 sections of subfloor he'd cut and refinished, when he first moved in a project he'd told himself was about installing additional insulation. And that was, in fact, about something else entirely, was a space 18 inches deep and 6 feet across. Dry, insulated, lined with a layer of foam padding from a camping mat he'd cut to fit. Comfortable, but stable temperature, acoustically dampened by the floor structure above it, and completely invisible to anyone who hadn't built it themselves. He went back to Eli's room and sat on the edge of his son's bed. He kept his voice low and even. Hey, wake up for a second. Eli came up from sleep slowly, which was the fever's work. His eyes opened partially, focused with effort. Dad, I need you to do something for me. What time is it? Or early. Depends how you look at it. He kept his tone easy. The same tone he used when Eli woke from nightmares level, present. Nothing alarming in it. How we've talked about drills? Fire drills. Shelter drills. Eli blinked. Even sick, the recognition was there. They'd done the drills 4 times over the last 2 years. Mason had framed them as preparedness practice, the same way rural families practice tornado response. Eli had accepted this because Eli was perceptive enough to understand that his father had reasons for things, even when the reasons weren't explained. Eli said, "This is one of those. I need you to be really quiet and do exactly what I say, okay?" A pause. The boy searched his father's face. "Are we okay?" "We're okay," Mason said. "We're going to be okay. But I need you to move right now and be completely quiet." "Can you do that?" Eli sat up. He was unsteady from the fever, and Mason put one hand on his back. The boy was small in the dark of the room. Small in the way that children are, in ways you forget until a moment like this makes you see it again. "Ghost is downstairs," Mason said. "He's going to stay with you." "Where are you going to be?" "Close. You'll be able to hear me." Eli looked at him once more. Then he nodded. It took 6 minutes to move Eli and get him settled in the concealed floor space with the camping mat, 2 blankets and the water bottle, and a small chemical heat pack that Mason cracked and placed near his feet. Ghost went in with him without being told. The dog curled against the boy's side like he'd been doing it for years, which, for whatever time he'd had before Ryan Donovan, he probably had. Mason replaced the subfloor sections. He stood in the empty room for a moment, listening to the storm and the cabin's small sounds, the heater cycling, the north wall flexing in the wind. Then he went back downstairs. Donovan had found the plate carrier and was looking at it. "I can wear this," she said, with modification. "Your right shoulder. I can wear it." She met his eyes. "I'm not sitting in a corner." He looked at the carrier, at her, and made the calculation. She was one-armed for practical purposes, head injured, running on adrenaline over shock. She was also trained, was thinking clearly, and had more reason to stand and fight than most people ever accumulated in a lifetime. He took the carrier, cut the right shoulder strap with a knife, and rigged a single arm, fastening with the length of the nylon webbing from the kit. It wasn't correct, but it would keep the plates in position on her torso, which was the relevant part. She tested the movement, nodded. He handed her the Glock and 3 magazines. She checked the weapon the same way he had: drop, rack, inspect, reload. Wasted motion. Left hand dominant on the controls, right hand providing minimal stabilizing support, compensating for the shoulder injury without thinking about it. He watched her do it. Neither of them said anything about what that said. He put the plate carrier on himself and set the Remington across the kitchen table where he could reach it. The radio went on the counter, powered on, volume low. He dialed to the state police analog backup frequency and keyed it twice short, quick without speaking. If anyone was monitoring, that was enough to communicate presence without transmitting location or content. If he was lucky, someone on the other end had noted the frequency and time. If he was lucky. He tried not to build plans around luck. Donovan stood beside the kitchen table and looked at the north-facing window. The storm pressed against the glass, opaque and white and constant. He's going to come before morning, she said. He can't wait for communications to restore. If outside agencies make contact and he hasn't, she stopped, reorganized the sentence. He has to resolve this before daylight. Before anyone outside this valley knows I'm alive. Mason had reached the same conclusion an hour ago. Voss's window was closing and Voss knew it. The blizzard was both his cover and his deadline. It was what gave him freedom to act without witnesses, and it was what would eventually end and expose whatever he'd done here. Probably within the next 2 hours, Mason said. He needs dark and he needs the storm. 2 hours, maybe less. She absorbed this without changing expression. Then she pulled the chair out from the table and sat down, not because she wanted to, but because her body was cashing in on something, and she had enough tactical sense to bank rest when she could. Tell me about the cabin, she said. Layout. Vulnerabilities. Everything, he told her. It took 15 minutes, and when it was done, she asked 3 precise questions that told him she'd been listening with the right part of her training, the part that thought about fields of fire and fatal funnels and the physics of how people move. Through space, when they're scared and when they're not. Outside, the storm continued. The radio on the counter produced nothing but quiet static. Somewhere in the dark and the trees and the snow, 8 or 10 or 12 men waited for a man they thought they understood to make the mistake they were counting on. Mason finished checking the Remington, laid it back on the table, and looked at the window. 40 yards of open ground between the tree line and the front of the cabin. The snow would slow them. The dark would help them. The wind would cover sound in both directions, which cut both ways. He had the layout. He had the high ground metaphorically, anyway. Every room, every angle, every creak in the floor. What he didn't have yet was a reason to believe that was enough. The radio made a sound. Not static. Not the regular wash of empty frequency. Something with a pattern underneath it, the leading edge of a voice transmission. Distant. Breaking up in the storm. He crossed to it in 3 steps and turned the volume up slightly, pressing his ear close. It broke up. A word. 2 words. Weather interference, frequency fragmentation, the signal coming in through 40 miles of storm-disrupted atmosphere. He couldn't make out there. Through the static. Clear for just 2 seconds. All units, Black Pine County, we are initiating. Then it was gone. He stayed with his ear at the radio for a full minute. Nothing came back. But it meant someone was out there. Someone with a radio on this frequency and knowledge of Black Pine. State police, maybe. Or the federal investigator Briggs, operating on an emergency frequency if he'd realized Donovan was in trouble. He turned the radio volume back down. Donovan was watching him from the table. Something? She asked. Maybe. He stood up. Or maybe not. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark. But it changes things slightly. How? Because if there's any chance someone outside is trying to get in, our job isn't just to survive the next 2 hours. He looked back at her. Our job is to still be alive and functional when they get here. She looked at him steadily. That was always the job, she said. He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. Then Ghost, who had been silent for 40 minutes, stood up from the corner where he'd been lying and walked to the front door and sat down rigid, every muscle under his coat pulled tight. And from somewhere outside, very close now, something that was not the wind or the storm or a tree branch snapping under ice weight made a sound against the west wall of the cabin. The sound came again, not wind, not a branch. Something with weight and intention behind it, a boot heel catching the edge of the wooden siding, or a gloved hand steadying against the wall, or someone pressing their back flat against the exterior, and moving along it inch by inch. Mason couldn't tell which. What he could tell was that it was on the west side, near the corner closest to the barn, which meant whoever made that sound had crossed 40 yards of open ground without him seeing them, and was now close enough to the cabin wall that he'd lost the angle. He looked at Donovan. She'd already moved off the chair, back against the interior wall, Glock up at low, ready, with her left hand doing most of the work and her right forearm, providing whatever stabilization her shoulder allowed. Her breathing was controlled. Eyes on him, waiting. He held up one finger, then pointed west, then 2 fingers pointed east. She processed it, nodded. He killed the kitchen light. The darkness hit them instantly and completely. No moon through the storm. The only light source was the faint orange glow from the wood stove's air vent, and that was just enough to turn the room into shapes and shadows and nothing else. Ghost stayed by the front door. He hadn't escalated, still the flat, rigid attention, not the hair-up alarm, which meant whatever was moving on the west wall wasn't moving toward an entry point. Yet Mason went to the window beside the west wall, moving in the dark by memory, and came at it from below the sill level. He rose just enough to clear the window's lower frame and looked out at an angle. 2 shapes, west corner of the cabin, one moving along the wall toward the front. The second one had stopped at the propane tank, housing a metal enclosure, mounted against standard rural construction, the kind of thing you'd know to look at if you wanted to cut utilities, or if you wanted to know the exact dimensions of the structure before you went in. They were measuring, building the picture of the interior layout from the outside, which meant they were close to go. He dropped back below the window and moved to the hallway. 2 on the west, he said in Donovan's direction, voice barely above breath level. They're pre-entry. We've got maybe 5 minutes. Front door? They'll want multiple entry points simultaneously. Front, back, possibly a window breach. He thought through it. The stairwell is the natural choke point. Anyone entering from the front door faces a 90-degree turn to reach the stairs. Anyone coming through the back has to get through the kitchen, which you know better than they do. Which I know better than they do, he agreed. He heard her move in the dark, the soft sound of her shifting weight, her boots on the floor. What do you need from me, she said. Kitchen. Back door. If it opens, you don't wait to see who it is. A pause. These are law enforcement, she said. The words had an edge to them, not weakness, but the friction of someone who understood the weight of what they were saying. They stopped being law enforcement the night they killed your husband, Mason said. It came out flat and without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. She was quiet for 2 seconds. Kitchen, she said. Back door. He went to the foot of the stairs. In the dark above him, the second floor was silent. The subfloor space was holding he couldn't hear Eli, couldn't hear Ghost, which was exactly what he needed. He pressed one hand against the wall at the bottom of the staircase and stood there for a moment, listening to the storm and the quiet and the absence of the sounds he was waiting for. Every window in the front of the cabin blew white. Flashlight beams, 3 of them, sweeping across the front face of the cabin from outside, not searching, announcing, establishing blind spots in the eyes of anyone looking out. It was a coordination signal. Someone had called go, and the lights were the mark. Mason moved. He went up the first 4 stairs fast and quiet, pressing his weight to the inside edge where the boards were over the central beam and least likely to creak. The 5th stair had a flex in it. He cleared it with a long stride. By the top of the staircase, he had the Remington at his shoulder, angled toward the landing window that overlooked the front approach. He didn't look out the window. He positioned himself so that the window was in his peripheral field and watched the top of the staircase instead. Whoever came through the front door would move through the entry and turn the stair in for it. Was the instinct clear the ground floor and take the high ground? Every tactical entry training produced that instinct because it was correct almost every time. Almost. The front door took 3 kicks before it gave. Mason seemed Sue Winifred framed 4 winters ago with the steel strike plate. It had held 2 kicks longer than it should have, against someone who knew what they were doing, which told him something about the people coming through it. 3 men entered fast. The way it was supposed to be done spread. Low, Immediate direction change to avoid stacking in the fatal funnel. One went left toward the living area. One went right toward the hallway. One came straight for the stairs. Mason waited until the man's head cleared the top step. He fired once. Buckshot at 6 feet in a narrow stairwell. The sound was enormous. The man went down backward into the person coming up behind him. Downstairs, chaos, shouting. The two who'd split left and right were reacting to the shot, which meant they'd lost the program for a second. That was the second he needed. He moved down the stairs fast, stepping over the man at the bottom down, but breathing. Mason noted the rise and fall of the chest without stopping and turned left toward the front entry before the man by the living area had finished repositioning. The deputy was turning toward him. Mason closed the distance in 4 steps, used the barrel of the Remington as a direction changer, stripped the sidearm from the man's holster with his left hand in a single practiced motion that the man hadn't expected, because people who look like quiet single fathers in rural Wyoming don't do that, and drove the deputy into the wall hard enough to bring a framed photograph off the nail. The man went down, stayed down. Mason wasn't sure whether it was the wall or the adrenaline crash that did it, and didn't spend time finding out. The third one, the hallway, was smarter. He'd backed against the wall instead of charging in. In the dark and the confusion and the roaring in everyone's ears from the stairwell shot, he was a shape against a shape, nearly invisible. Mason saw the muzzle flash before he heard the shot a single second, where the room went white, and felt the round go past his left ear close enough that the pressure differential was physical. He dropped below the next shot and moved toward the shooter's position, using the muzzle flash as a map. It was close and ugly, and not the way it looked in any training scenario he'd ever run. The deputy was big and panic makes people strong in ways that are inconvenient when you're 3 feet away from them and the weapon is between you. They went into the hallway wall together. Something cracked. Could have been the drywall. Could have been something in the deputy's arm. Mason didn't know, and the deputy's yell was telling but not specific. Weapon came free. Mason cleared the round from the chamber by instinct and dropped the weapon. From the kitchen, a single shot. Clean. Not panicked. Silence from that direction. He stood in the hallway, in the dark, breathing through his nose, listening. 3 in through the front. 1 down in the stairwell. 1 down in the living area. 1 in the hallway in front of him. Still breathing, but not getting up. From the kitchen, Donovan called out, her voice controlled and hard. Clear back. Clear front, Mason said. He gave it 5 seconds, then moved. Donovan was standing 2 feet from the back door, which had been kicked open and was now letting in a blade of winter air and blowing snow. A man was on the kitchen floor. She had her weapon up and was watching the open doorway with the fixed attention of someone, waiting for the next thing to come through it. Nothing came. The wind howled through the open door, drifted across the threshold. 1, she said without looking at him. 3 front, total of 4. Voss brought more than 4. He moved to the wall beside the back door and looked out at the rear yard at an angle. He stopped. Somewhere above them on the second floor, something moved. Both of them went still. A footstep. The particular creak that came from the floor directly above the kitchen, which was the doorway to his bedroom. Someone had come in through the second floor of the bedroom window, which faced east and was screened from his angle downstairs by the roofline, a detail he had accounted for, and then, somewhere between the front entry and the hallway fight, lost track of. He took the stairs in silence, left hand on the Remington, moving fast without running, because running upstairs in the dark produced sound and stumbling produced outcomes he couldn't afford. The bedroom door was open. He hadn't left it open. He went through the doorway low and moved right, which was away from the window. The entry point would be where they expected him to look first, and that expectations was a geometry he could use. The man with the flashlight was at the center of the room, turning. Mason was already inside his arm's reach. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not something Mason thought about consciously. It was the product of 11 years of training that had been executed so many times under conditions real and simulated that it had stopped living in the thinking part of his mind entirely and moved somewhere below that. The same place where breathing lives and blinking. The man went down without firing his weapon. Mason stood over him in the dark bedroom and breathed. Then he heard it. Eli's room. The door that he had left closed was open by 2 inches, and through the 2-inch gap, thin bar of flashlight, moving across the floor. Someone was in his son's room. The part of him that had been running cold and calculated and operational for the last 7 minutes cracked. Broke. Cracked. A hairline fracture across the surface of the machine, and what came through it, not the controlled force of a trained operator, but something older and more fundamental and considerably more dangerous. He moved to the door and pushed it open. One man, standing in the middle of Eli's empty room with a flashlight, scanning. He turned when the door opened, and in the half-second before he processed what he was looking at, Mason saw his face young, maybe 28, the expression of someone who hadn't expected to find a bed and a nightstand and a child's drawing on the wall and was now recalibrating. "He's not here," the deputy said. Not to Mason, to a radio, a coil wire running to an earpiece. "Room's empty." Mason crossed the room. The deputy managed to get a hand up. It didn't matter. He went down. He stayed down. His radio earpiece produced a voice, someone asking for a status update, the tone urgent, and Mason pulled the earpiece free and listened. The voice was Voss's. "Give me the status on the upstairs. What's happening in there? Talk to me." Mason held the earpiece without responding. He could hear, in the background of Voss's transmission, wind, an engine. Voss was outside, close, and he was listening to the radio traffic from his team and getting nothing useful back, and he was beginning to understand that the operation had gone wrong in some significant way. The voice came again. Less controlled this time. "All units report. Somebody talk to me right now." Silence on the channel. Mason counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing from downstairs. Nothing from outside. Whatever positions Voss had set around the perimeter, those people were either watching and waiting or they were on a different channel. The assault team, the people Voss had sent inside, were not reporting because they could not report. He dropped the earpiece on the floor and went back to the landing. "Donovan, here." She was at the base of the stairs, looking up. Her face was hard to read in the dark, but her voice was steady. "Voss is outside. He's on the radio and he's not getting responses." A pause. "He'll come in himself," she said, "or he'll burn it." The sentence sat between them for a moment. Burning was what you did when the operation collapsed, and you needed to eliminate evidence, and you had no other options. A structure fire in a blizzard, in an isolated location, on a night when communications were down, it could be explained. A propane explosion, a wood stove malfunction, a tragic accident on a night when nobody could reach the area to respond. It was also what you did when you stopped caring about being careful and started caring only about making the problem go away. "The propane housing," Mason said. The 2 men by the west wall, one of them, was at the propane housing. He came downstairs. Donovan moved with him into the kitchen, both of them at the back doorway now, looking out at the rear yard and the barn. Nothing moved out there. The snow was still coming down, and the wind was still working, and the tree line was 40 feet of indistinct dark. He'd need something to start it, Donovan said. Accelerant, or a direct ignition on the line. He came prepared. Mason looked at the propane housing through the kitchen window, 20 feet from the cabin wall. If someone had tampered with the regulator or the shutoff valve, or if the line had been compromised, the propane tank becoming a problem wasn't hypothetical. He made a decision. "We need to move Eli," he said. He thought about it. The barn was wood bad in a fire scenario. The truck was in the front, which was where Voss was. Basement access was through the kitchen floor, which was the first room to go if the propane housing was compromised. "Barn," he said. "It's the best of bad options. Northwest corner, away from the cabin. If the propane goes, the explosion radius probably doesn't reach the barn structure." "Probably." "Yeah," she looked at him. "How do we get to your son without going through the front?" she said. He said, "We go out the back and circle the cabin." He was already moving when the first shot came through the kitchen window. A rifle shot a shotgun. From close range, the pattern across the kitchen wall and took out the window frame and the cabinet above the sink. And Mason felt something hit his left forearm with the force of a punch, but no penetrating impact, which meant the plate carrier's side extension had caught it, or a fragment had hit the jacket and not gone through. He dropped to the floor. Donovan was already down, the plate carrier's weight pulling her to the right side, but she managed it. "Back door," he said. They went low through the open back door onto the rear step, both of them below the sight line of the kitchen window, Mason in front with the Remington and Donovan covering the rear angle with the Glock. The cold hit them like something physical 30 years below zero wind chill, the air so dry it cracked. He moved them along the back wall of the cabin, away from the window, away from the propane side toward the northeast corner. Step in snow that came to mid-calf and pulled at his boots and made every movement slower than it needed to be. He heard a voice from the direction of the front of the cabin. Two voices now, coordinating, and then boot steps on snow-compacted ground. They circled the northeast corner, and Mason stopped. The front of the property was lit now, vehicle headlights on, two trucks positioned facing the cabin, the beams washing the front face in flat white light. Voss stood between the trucks with two men beside him, all three looking at the cabin, and in Voss's hand was something that Mason identified in 3/4 of a second. A flare gun. Not a weapon, specifically. The kind of emergency signaling device that any rural law enforcement vehicle would carry. The kind that, fired into a propane vent or an exterior gas line junction, would accomplish in a single moment what an arsonist with accelerant might take 10 minutes to set up. Voss hadn't seen them yet. He was looking at the cabin, talking to the man on his left. 40 feet of open ground between Mason and Voss, two men flanking. At least two more somewhere in the perimeter he couldn't currently see. And Voss with a handheld incendiary device and a clear line of sight to the propane housing. Donovan was at his shoulder. He could hear her controlled breathing behind him. "He sees the cabin going dark," she said quietly. "He thinks his people cleared it. He's not sure, but he's moving that direction." Mason watched Voss take 2 steps toward the propane housing. The two flanking men fanned slightly, covering the approach. Professional spacing, clean sight lines, the kind of movement that came from repetition. He made the calculation. He could reach the flare gun before Voss fired. Probably. If he moved now, directly, without hesitation, at speed across the open ground. The math was close. The variables were bad snow drag, 2 flanking armed men, the visibility that the headlights created cutting both ways. The math was close. He'd run worse math than this on worse nights, but not with Eli in the floor of the cabin behind him. "The radio," Donovan said suddenly. He looked at her. "The analog radio. You said someone might be monitoring." Her voice was fast and controlled, the words chosen efficiently. "If there's any chance, if Briggs activated, if state police is trying to get through, you need to transmit. Location, nature of threat, everything. Even if you're not sure anyone hears it. Transmitting gives away our position. Position doesn't matter in about 40 seconds, she said. He's going to fire that flare." Mason looked at Voss, at the propane housing, looked at the 40 feet of open ground. He pulled the radio from his jacket pocket, keyed the transmit button. Any station. This is an emergency transmission on analog backup, Black Pine County, Wyoming. Armed hostiles at private residence on Ridgeline Mountain Road, 7 miles north of town center. We have an injured law enforcement officer, a child on site, and an imminent threat of arson. We need immediate response. This is Mason Rourke. I am transmitting blind. If you are hearing this." Voss's head turned. He'd heard the transmission. The radio's signal was strong, and the wind had shifted for just a second. And Voss was 30 feet away, and he heard it. His eyes found Mason at the cabin corner. For 1 second, one full, frozen, absolute second, the two men looked at each other across the lit snow. Voss with the flare gun in his hand and the cold expression of a man who had spent 22 years deciding what truth looked like in this county. Mason with the Remington at his hip and the radio in his hand, and 2 years of a quiet, careful, invisible life dissolving in real time. Voss raised the flare gun. Mason moved, not toward cover. Voss. He crossed the open ground at a dead sprint in snow that grabbed at him with every step, the Remington up. Voss swinging the flare gun to track him. And Mason did not shoot, because he needed Voss alive, and he needed the flare gun, and everything else could sort itself out in the aftermath. The two flanking men were turning, reacting the half-second delay of people who hadn't expected the man they were surrounding to sprint directly at them, rather than retreat. Voss fired. The flare went wide. Mason had broken the targeting geometry by closing the distance faster than the angle accounted for, and the burning round went past his right shoulder and hissed into the snowbank behind him, into the propane housing. He hit Voss at full speed. They went down together onto the packed snow in front of the cabin, the flare gun spinning away. Voss was heavy and strong, and 22 years of maintaining authority didn't mean he hadn't done it physically when he had to. He fought back hard elbow, knee, a hand finding Mason's jacket collar. Mason broke the grip, pinned the arm, pressed his forearm across Voss's throat, with enough pressure to be specific and clear about the conversation they were now having. Voss went still, breathing hard through his nose, looking up at Mason with an expression that had finally shed the practiced reasonableness underneath it and showed what had always been there. Panic. No, fear. Just the cold calculation of a man deciding what his next move was. Mason said. It was the only word he said. Was enough. The flanking men had stopped 4 feet away. They were looking at their sheriff, on the ground, and the man holding him there, and doing the arithmetic of a situation that had gone completely sideways of every version of tonight they'd planned for. Donovan stepped out from the cabin corner. Glock up, left-handed, completely steady. Weapons down, she said. Right now. Both of you. One of them moved his hand toward his holster, not drawing, just touching, the involuntary gesture of someone running options. She said, same word Mason had used, same weight behind it. The hand came away from the holster. Both men placed their weapons in the snow. Voss made a sound under Mason's arm. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that came out of a person when the architecture of their life was coming down around them, and they hadn't found the response yet that fit the size of it. From somewhere out in the dark of the tree line, a third vehicle engine caught, and headlights came on not Voss's people. The vehicle was on the county road below, and the lights were red and blue, cycling through the storm. Then another set. Then a third. The radio in Mason's jacket pocket came alive. A voice, clean and strong now. Static. Fragmentation. This is Special Agent Daniel Briggs, FBI. We are on Ridgeline Mountain Road approximately 4 minutes out. If you can hear this, hold your position. Help is coming. The voice was steady and professional, and it was, in its way, the best sound Mason had heard all night. He pressed his forearm a fraction harder into Voss's throat. To hurt, just to be clear. 4 minutes, he said quietly. Voss stared up at him. The red and blue lights moved through the trees at the bottom of the mountain, climbing. The blizzard didn't stop. The cold didn't lift. Voss's 2 deputies stood in the snow with their weapons on the ground and their hands visible, and Donovan stood with the Glock trained and her shoulder held wrong, and her face expressionless. And Ghost appeared at the open front door of the cabin and sat in the doorway and watched all of it with the quiet, particular patience of an animal that had been waiting a long time for something to be over. Mason stayed where he was. He didn't feel relief, not yet. Relief was for after, when you'd confirmed every member of your element was accounted for, and every threat was neutralized, and the extraction was complete. He had a son in a hidden floor space, and an injured officer, and a property full of people who needed to be sorted and documented, and a long, cold night still ahead of him before any of that was done. What he felt, in the space between Voss's labored breathing and the approaching lights, was something quieter than relief and harder to name. He'd spent 2 years being the man nobody looked twice at, the man who fixed his own fences and made his son breakfast, and drove too carefully on icy roads, and went to the hardware store on Saturday mornings and nodded to his neighbors, and never said much. That man was real. Mason had meant every part of him. He was not only that man. He had never been only that man. And tonight, with 9 degrees below zero, and a blizzard, and a sheriff who'd spent 2 years mistaking his silence for weakness that had mattered. The first federal vehicle came over the ridge, then the second. Then, through the radio, Briggs's voice again. We see the property. We're coming in. Mason finally moved his arm off Voss's throat. He stood up, left Voss on the ground, hands spread in the snow, looking up at the spinning lights arriving through the dark. He walked back into the cabin, up the stairs, into the bedroom. He pulled up the subfloor sections and looked down into the space beneath. Eli was awake. Ghost was pressed against the boy's side, and Eli's hand was in the dog's fur. And when the light hit his face, Eli looked up at his father with the expression he'd had since he was 4, the one that asked questions he was too polite to speak. Is it done? Eli said. Mason crouched down by the opening. He said, It's done. Eli looked at him for a moment. His eyes went to his father's jacket, the scorch mark from the flare going past, the tear in the left arm, the absence of anything that looked like the composed, careful father who'd been making him soup yesterday. You're dirty, Eli said. Mason looked down at himself. He said again, I know. He reached into the space and put his hand on his son's back and held it there, and outside the federal vehicles rolled up to the cabin, and doors opened, and voices started, and the night began, slowly, to become something survivable. The first federal agent through the door was a woman mid-40s, short hair, a jacket that said FBI in yellow letters across the back and had snow on the shoulders from the walk up the driveway. She had her hand on her sidearm, but hadn't drawn it, and her eyes moved through the cabin interior in the practiced sweep of someone who'd cleared a lot of rooms and was doing it now, even though the fight was technically over. She found Mason at the base of the stairs with Eli against his side, and Ghost sitting on the boy's feet. Her hand came off the sidearm. Mason Rourke, she said. Agent Sandra Holt, FBI. You have injured? Officer Donovan Kitchen. Head wound, dislocated shoulder, reduced. She needs a hospital. He looked at her. She goes first. We've got a medic outside. I'll send him in. She was already on her radio, clipped short sentences into it that Mason caught in pieces. Female officer, kitchen, priority transport. Then she looked at Eli. This your son? Yes. He okay? Fever. He needs antibiotics. The reason I was out on that road tonight. Holt looked at Eli for a second at the boy's flushed face, his hand in his father's jacket, the calm, watchful expression he was maintaining better than most adults would in the same situation. We'll get him seen, she said, and the directness of it, padding around it, was something Mason appreciated. 2 more agents came through the front door. From outside, he could hear the organized noise of federal personnel, working through the scene, voices calling clear. The sound of flex cuffs, someone reading rights in the cold. Through the kitchen window, the lights were multiplying. Someone had pulled a vehicle around to face the rear of the property, and the headlights were flooding the backyard white. Donovan appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd gotten herself to her feet, and she was upright, and she was not leaning on the wall, but she was pale in a way that wasn't just the light, and her right arm was pressed against her body at the angle that said the shoulder reduction hadn't held cleanly, or the adrenaline was finishing and the pain was catching up. Agent Holt looked at her. Officer Donovan? Yes. Special Agent Briggs is outside. He'd like to speak with you when the medics clear you. I'll speak with him now. Ma'am, I've been building this case for 18 months. I'll speak with him now. She said it without heat, just a statement of how things were going to go, and Holt absorbed it and nodded once. A medic came through the back door, young, male the kit, on his back, large enough to suggest he was prepared for worse than what he found. He took one look at Donovan and moved toward her, and she let him, which told Mason more about how she was actually feeling than anything she'd said. Tugged Mason's sleeve. Dad, the dog needs water. Mason looked down at his son. Yeah, he said. You're right. Come on. Briggs was not what Mason had expected. He'd expected the federal agent to be the kind of man who announced himself, big voice, big presence, the gravity of the bureau, worn like a second jacket. Instead, Briggs was slight 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a coat that was too thin for the weather, and the general appearance of a man who spent most of his time at a desk and had driven 4 hours through a blizzard tonight and was tired in the specific way that came from caring too much about something for too long. He found Mason on the front porch 20 minutes after the vehicles arrived. Mason was sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee from the medic's kit, instant, terrible, exactly what he needed, and watching the federal agents work the scene. Voss was in the back of one of the vehicles. Deputies who could walk were flex-cuffed and sitting against the side of the barn. The ones who couldn't walk were being seen to by the medics. Briggs sat down on the step beside him without introduction. You called it in on an analog backup frequency, he said. That's right. We almost didn't catch it. One of our vehicles was running an analog scanner as a secondary, and the operator had the volume up higher than protocol because the digital net was dropping out in the storm. He paused. If she'd had it at standard volume, you'd have transmitted into nothing, Mason said. Briggs looked at him sideways. Doesn't seem to bother you. It worked. Doesn't matter how close the margin was. A pause. Briggs looked out at the scene, at his agents moving through the property, at the lights, at the snow that was finally tentatively starting to thin. I need to understand what happened tonight, Briggs said. Specifically, I need to understand the sequence of events and the decision-making at each stage, because I am going to spend the next 6 months explaining this to a federal prosecutor, and I need the story to be. He seemed to choose his next word. Complete. That's a different way of saying, you want to know if I did anything tonight that's going to make your case complicated, Mason said. Briggs tilted his head slightly, which was apparently his version of conceding a point. Walk me through it, he said. Mason did. He kept it linear and factual, and he didn't editorialize. He found the cruiser. He transported Donovan. He identified a threat perimeter. He moved his son to a secure location. He defended the structure against entry. He transmitted on the backup frequency. When he finished, Briggs was quiet for a moment. 6 deputies down, he said. 3 with injuries serious enough for hospital transport. One of them has a fractured radius. He was in a room where my son sleeps, Mason said. Briggs absorbed this. I'm going to need your service record, he said. Your full separation documentation. Operational background. Why? Because what you've described doing tonight is going to raise questions about proportionality and civilian use of force, and having the documentation that explains your training. My training doesn't create a different legal standard for force, Mason said. It's the same standard. Imminent threat to life. It was present. I acted. That's correct in principle, Briggs said carefully. In practice, a prosecutor looks at 6 injured law enforcement officers, and they ask questions. Corrupt law enforcement officers, Mason said, who entered my home by force, with weapons, while my 7-year-old son was inside. I understand that. Good. Mason took a sip of the bad coffee. Answer your questions. All of them. In whatever format you need. But I want Eli in a warm vehicle with a medic before we do another word of this. Briggs looked at him. That's fair, he said. Eli got the antibiotics 2 hours before sunrise. One of the medics had a pediatric kit that included broad-spectrum oral antibiotics, a seizure protocol kit, as it turned out, that a cautious field medic had packed because rural deployments sometimes produced exactly the situation they were now in. The medic checked Eli's temperature, his throat, his lymph nodes, asked him questions in the easy tone that good medical people use with children, and administered the first dose in the back of one of the federal SUVs, where the heat was running. Eli sat in the warmed seat with Ghost on the floor at his feet and drank the antibiotics mixed in the remains of Mason's terrible coffee, 'cause the only juice available was a pack of orange-flavored powder, and Eli had drawn a hard line on. Orange-flavored powder in a position that Mason thought was reasonable. Mason sat in the front passenger seat and watched his son in the rear-view mirror. Eli said, "The lady. Officer Donovan. What about her?" Eli thought about it for a second. She knew Ghost. Yeah, she did. How? Mason turned around in the seat and looked at his son directly. Eli was better than fever, still flushed, still tired, but the sharp, tracking quality of his eyes was back, and that was the real indicator. Ghost belonged to her husband, Mason said. Before we found him. What happened to her husband? A beat. He died, Mason said, doing his job. Eli looked at Ghost. The dog was watching Eli, with the particular dog attention that doesn't waver, doesn't multitask, that just stays completely on the one thing it has decided matters. Does she miss him? Eli said. Yeah, Mason said. She does. Eli petted the top of Ghost's head slowly. The dog leaned into it. Ghost misses him too, Eli said. I think, when he gets that quiet way. Mason looked at his son for another moment. He turned back around in the seat. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. The debrief happened in 2 stages. The first stage was structured, formal, recorded on a device she placed on the kitchen table between them while the scene outside was still being processed. She took Mason through the same sequence Briggs had covered, but in finer detail times, positions, distances, exact language used in conversations. She was good at it, unhurried, not aggressive. She asked clarifying questions that were precise enough to tell him she had field experience and wasn't purely administrative. When she got to the stairwell, she stopped. The first engagement, she said. The individual in the stairwell. Your assessment of the level of force used. He's alive, Mason said. He is. She made a note. In your judgment, at the moment of engagement, Was there a non-lethal alternative available? Can you elaborate? He'd cleared the top step. The stairwell is 42 inches wide. At that distance with that weapon, there was no shot that didn't carry the risk I applied. The alternative to what I did was what he was about to do. Holt wrote something. Then she looked up. You said 42 inches. You measured it? I measured everything in this cabin when I moved in, Mason said. She looked at him for a moment. Who does that? She said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, with a tone underneath it that said she was beginning to understand something about the man sitting across from her. Someone who knows that information matters, Mason said. She held his gaze for a second. Then she made another note. The second stage of the debrief was harder. It happened after Holt stepped outside to confer with Briggs, and a third agent came in, a man named Carver. He'd intervened, who had the kind of face that had made a decision about Mason before entering the room and was conducting the conversation from inside that decision. He sat down. He did not offer his hand or give his full title. Former C said, Yes, Team 6, DVU is not a public designation, Mason said. I'm not going to confirm or deny component assignments. Carver looked at him with a flat expression that was its own kind of answer. What I'm trying to establish, Carver said, is whether the level of force applied tonight was within the bounds of reasonable civilian conduct. Whether we're looking at a situation where specialized training was used in a manner that could be characterized as excessive, Mason said. I was going to say disproportionate. 6 armed men entered my home, Mason said. My child was on the property. 3 of the 6 are ambulatory. The other 3 will be ambulatory within days. If I had been what Voss thought, I was a regular civilian with no training, then everyone in this building, including my son, would be dead, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. He paused. Disproportionate works in both directions, Agent Carver. Carver set his pen down. You understand that this situation is going to require review at multiple levels. I understand that, Mason said. I'm available for every level. I'll answer every question. I'll produce whatever documentation you need from my service record. He met Carver's eyes. But I'd ask you to consider something before you walk into that review with a narrative already built. And what's that? Voss had 22 years to build this network. 22 years of being the authority in this county, of deciding what the law meant and who it applied to and who it could be used against. He killed a man. He had his K-9 tortured and abandoned. He was prepared tonight to kill an injured officer and a 7-year-old child and burn the structure around them. Mason kept his voice level, angry level, because anger would have given Carver something to work with. I've been in Black Pine for 2 years. I keep to myself. I fix my fence and I get my son to school and I don't bother anyone. And tonight I stopped Voss from completing what he started 18 months ago. He paused. If that requires review, I'll sit in every room you put me in, but I'm not going to apologize for it. Carver was quiet. Buddy's asking you to apologize, he said, after a moment. Mason said, Then we're clear. The truth about Deputy Chief Russell Kane came out before noon. It came out because Voss, once he understood the weight of what Briggs had on him, once the financial documentation was recovered from the evidence compartment of the overturned cruiser, the compartment exactly as Donovan had described it, waterproofed and intact, made the calculation that a cooperating defendant was a different thing than an uncooperating one. Briggs came to Mason at 10 in the morning with a coffee that was better than the instant and sat down at the kitchen table across from him. The cabin was emptier now. Most of the federal presence had shifted to a command post established at the county sheriff's building, which was now federal property pending investigation. Kane, Briggs said. Mason waited. Deputy Chief Russell Kane, Ryan Donovan's supervisor, his mentor. Briggs wrapped both hands around his own coffee cup. According to Voss's preliminary statement this morning, Kane was the one who coordinated the operation that killed Ryan Donovan. He managed the logistics. He selected the location. He was present, a pause. Ghost was with Ryan that night. Kane was the one who took the dog into custody afterward. Mason sat with this. Where is Kane now? He said. He retired 8 months ago, moved to a property outside of Laramie. Briggs looked at him. We have agents en route. We'll have him in custody before tonight. Does Donovan know? Not yet. Briggs met his eyes. I thought it should come from someone she trusts. Mason looked at the table surface. We've known each other for about 9 hours, he said. Long 9 hours, Briggs said. He left soon after. Mason sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. Through the window he could see. The snow had mostly stopped. The sky was still heavy, but the wind had died down and the early light was doing something quiet and gray across the property. There were still federal vehicles parked in the driveway, but the frantic energy of the overnight operations had settled into the methodical work of documentation and processing. He found Donovan in the back of the medical SUV. She'd been properly assessed. By then the head wound had been cleaned and closed, with actual sutures by a paramedic who'd arrived with the second wave of vehicles. The shoulder had been properly re-reduced and immobilized, and she had an IV line in her left arm that was putting something into her that had taken the worst of the pain off her face. She was sitting upright, which the medic had probably told her not to do, looking out the medical window at the property. Mason got in on the other side. She looked at him. Something in his expression told her it wasn't nothing, because she straightened slightly and waited. He told her about Kane. He kept it short. He told her what Briggs had told him, the coordination, the logistics, the presence. The part about Ghost, he left until last, and when he told her, he watched the information move through her in a way that looked almost like nothing. From the outside, her jaw didn't change, her eyes didn't change, she didn't make a sound. But she turned away from him and looked out the window again, and the line of her throat moved once. They sat in the vehicle, and the gray morning light came through the glass. After a while, she said, "He came to our wedding." Mason didn't say anything. He gave a speech. He talked about Ryan like... She stopped. Started again. He said Ryan was the best officer he'd ever supervised. Was the exact phrase. The best officer. Another stop. I thanked him for it afterward. Mason sat with that. You didn't know, he said. No. Her voice was steady, but it was doing work to be steady. But I've been asking myself for 18 months how they found out Ryan had the documents. How they knew before he could move. And I kept coming back to the fact that the only person Ryan told before he told me. She stopped. The only person. Kane. She turned back to look at Mason. How long until they have him? Briggs said tonight. She nodded once. Then she looked out the window again, at the clearing property, at the place where Ghost was sitting in the snow beside the cabin door waiting for someone to tell him what came next. Knew, she said quietly, the whole time. Why he reacted to uniforms that way. Why he didn't trust he was there. He saw it happen. Mason looked at the dog. He thought about the shelter paperwork. Aggressive history unknown, not suitable for families. He thought about the first day he'd brought Ghost home, and the animal had stood in the corner of the kitchen for 4 hours before moving. About the 3 weeks before the dog would take food from his hand. About the particular gradual way Ghost had built trust, not through warmth, but through repetition, through the slow accumulation of evidence that the world could be predicted. Mason said he knew. The town found out by afternoon. In the way that small towns find out things not from official sources, but from the accumulative observation of neighbors who'd driven past the federal vehicles on the mountain road, who'd seen the lights overnight, who'd talked to the deputies' families, who'd watched the county sheriff's building get locked down. By 2 in the afternoon, Black Pine knew that Voss was in federal custody. By 4, they knew the rest of it. Mason went to town at 3 to get Eli's prescription filled properly at the pharmacy. The oral antibiotics from the medic's kit were bridging treatment, not a full course. He drove the truck down the now partially plowed mountain road and parked on Main Street and went into the pharmacy. He was at the counter when Dennis Hale, who owned the hardware store 3 doors down and had sold Mason roof sealant and PVC primer and approximately 40 conversations Mason hadn't particularly wanted, came in behind him. Dennis stopped when he saw Mason. He had the expression of a man who was reorganizing something. I heard what happened out there, Dennis said. Okay, Mason said. People are saying... Dennis stopped, started differently. I didn't know you were... It doesn't matter what I was, Mason said. He took the prescription bag from the pharmacist. It only matters what I did with it. Dennis looked at him. There was something in it that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite admiration, but was somewhere in the middle, the uncomfortable recognition of having underestimated someone for 2 years, of having treated a person as a quantity that turned out to be a different quantity entirely. Right, Dennis said finally. Well, he put his hands in his coat pockets. You need any help out there? At the property? I imagine there's damage. Mason thought about the front door. The windows. The kitchen wall, he said. There is. I've got some guys, Dennis said. Good ones. We could come up Saturday if the road's passable. Mason looked at him. It was the specific calculation that followed him, the one about letting people in, about the cost of it, and the other cost of not doing it. Yes, he'd been running that calculation for 2 years and getting the same answer. And tonight he wasn't sure the answer was still right. I'll let you know, he said. Briggs called at 7. Kane is in custody, he said. He waived his right to counsel for the first 30 minutes, spent those 30 minutes telling us everything. I've been in this work for 19 years, and I have never had a witness make that decision. But a pause. He seemed relieved. What did he say about Ryan Donovan? Mason asked. A longer pause. He confirmed Voss's account. He coordinated the operation. He was present. Another pause. He said it was the first time he understood what he'd actually become. Watching Ryan Donovan die. Briggs's voice was carefully neutral in the way that professional voices become carefully neutral when they're processing something they haven't filed away yet. He said that's when he understood it, but that he never told anyone, because telling anyone would have ended everything. Mason looked out the cabin window at the dark. It ended anyway, he said. They always do, Briggs said. It's just a question of what they take with them. After the call, Mason stood in the kitchen for a long time. Yet the door had been temporarily secured with the plasload that one of the federal agents had found in the barn, and Eli had supervised the installation with the serious attention of a child who understood. That doors were important, and this one needed to work. The kitchen window was taped with a garbage bag from under the sink. The cabin was cold in the places where the seals were broken, and warm in the places where the wood stove could reach, which created a strange gradient as you moved through the rooms. Donovan had been transported to the hospital in Weston for proper assessment and treatment, and would be there for at least 2 days. Before she left, she'd crouched down in front of Ghost and held the dog's face in her one good hand and said something to him quietly that Mason hadn't heard and hadn't tried to hear. Ghost had pressed his forehead against hers and held it there. She'd stood up and looked at Mason and said, "Thank you for picking up a stray." He hadn't known if she meant the dog or herself and hadn't asked. Upstairs, Eli was asleep in his bed, proper sleep, the fever having broken an hour after the first full antibiotic dose, his breathing slow and even and normal. Ghost was on the floor beside the bed. Neither of them had moved in 2 hours. Mason turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a while. He thought about the morning, about the federal review process and the questions he'd be asked, and the paperwork that would have to be filed. About the cabin and what it would take to put it back to something livable. About Eli and the conversation they would have to have some version of it, age-appropriate, honest about what had happened and what Mason had been, before he was the man Eli had always known. How you explain to a 7-year-old that the world contains people who choose to be what Voss was, and also people who choose to be something else, and that the choice matters more than the capability. He sat in the dark kitchen with the wood stove clicking and the plywood door holding out the cold and thought about all of it without coming to any conclusions. Some of it would take longer than one night. Most of it would take longer than one night. That was okay. He had time now, which 24 hours ago had not been certain. He got up eventually and went upstairs and checked on Eli's hand, on the forehead normal temperature, the undramatic verification that everything was as it should be, and then went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed. His left forearm had a bruise forming where the shot had hit the plate extension, a dark oval the size of a fist that would be spectacular by morning. His hands were steady, his mind was doing the thing it always did after operations, running back through the sequence, cataloging decisions, flagging anything that could have been done differently. It was an automatic process. It had kept him alive through enough versions of enough nights that he didn't try to stop it anymore. The forearm was the only physical damage. For what it had been, that was nothing short of. He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. It wasn't nothing short of anything. It was what it was. Some nights you came through, and some nights you didn't, and this was one of the former, and the matter, and you didn't spend time congratulating yourself on margins, because that was how you got careless about the next one. He lay back on the bed without taking his boots off, closed his eyes. Outside, the last of the storm moved east, and Blackpine settled into the kind of deep winter quiet that follows weather, the particular silence of a world that has been scoured clean and is waiting without urgency to see what comes next. He slept 4 hours. Because 4 hours was enough, it wasn't, and his body registered the deficit immediately when he woke, the kind of deep muscular exhaustion that came from sustained adrenaline and cold and the specific physical work of the night before. But 4 hours was what the situation allowed. At 7:15 in the morning, he heard Eli moving around upstairs, the particular sound of a 7-year-old navigating a morning without specific instruction, and that sound was enough to bring him up out of sleep with the completeness that parenthood installs in you. No gradual surfacing, no negotiation with consciousness, just awake and listening, and already sorting through the state of things. He lay there for 30 seconds doing exactly that. Fever gone, Eli moving, ghost quiet, which meant the property perimeter was clear. The plywood door was still holding, could hear the wind against it, but nothing else. Outside the bedroom window, the sky was the particular pale gray of a Wyoming morning after a storm. The light flat and clean and without the urgency of the blizzard. He got up. His boots were still on. The bruise on his left forearm had done what he'd predicted. It was a deep, spectacular purple-black across 4 inches of skin, tender when he pressed it, the kind of bruise that would take 2 weeks to resolve and prompt questions from anyone who saw it. He pulled his sleeve down and went downstairs. Eli was in the kitchen, standing in front of the refrigerator with the door open, studying its contents with the serious attention of someone who understood the problem and was working toward a solution. "No, there's eggs," Mason said from the doorway. "I know." Eli didn't look up. "I was going to make them myself. You've made eggs once." "How, though?" Mason came into the kitchen and opened the cabinet beside the stove. "Sit down. I'll make them." Eli closed the refrigerator and sat at the kitchen table. Ghost came downstairs behind Mason and went directly to his water bowl, drank, then went to the back door and looked at it. Mason opened the plywood, patched back door 6 inches to let him out, and stood there while the dog moved through the snow across the rear yard in the early light. "Dad," Eli said, "Yeah. Are the bad men gone?" Mason turned back to the kitchen. He got the eggs from the refrigerator and put the pan on the stove and turned the burner on before N.S. answered, because he needed the extra 4 seconds to figure out what the right version of honest was for a 7-year-old who'd spent a night in a hole in the floor and knew enough to know something significant had happened. "They're in federal custody," he said. "That means people who have more authority than them have them now. They're not coming back. Federal is like FBI, yes." Eli thought about this. The lady agent. The one with the yellow letters on her jacket. Yes. She seemed like she knew what she was doing. "She does," Mason said. He cracked the first egg. "She's good at her job." Eli drummed his fingers on the table. 2 taps. Stop. 2 taps, which was a thing he did when he was working toward a question he wasn't sure about asking. "Were you scared?" he said. Mason stood at the stove with the pan in front of him and thought about the honest answer. He said, "Parts of it." "Which parts?" "The parts that involved you." Eli was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't scared," he said. Immediately, "Well, a little. But Ghost was there. That's why I put him with you." "Did you know he would stay?" Another pause. Eli watched his father's back at the stove. "Did you do stuff like that before? When you were in the Navy?" Mason kept his attention on the pan. The eggs were catching at the edges, the way they did when the heat was too high. He dropped it slightly. "Different situations," he said. "Same general idea. Protecting people?" He thought about all the ways to answer that. The honest, complicated version, and the simple version, and the version that was true without being everything. "Yes," he said. "Protecting people." The eggs came out slightly overcooked on one side because he'd let the heat go too long while he was answering, but Eli ate them without complaint, which was a courtesy Mason recognized and appreciated. They ate together at the kitchen table with Ghost back inside and lying under the table with his head on Eli's foot. And outside the morning got gradually brighter as the cloud cover thinned, and for 20 minutes, nothing happened, and nobody needed anything, and it was the most normal 20 minutes Mason had in 36 hours. The federal review took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of daily interrogation, most of it was documentation. Interviews scheduled and conducted at the federal field office in Cheyenne, legal review of Mason's service record, which Briggs had formally requested through appropriate channels, and which had arrived with certain portions redacted and other portions that apparently answered the questions Carver had been asking, because Carver's manner in the second interview was measurably different from the first. Warm, just different, like a man who had revised an estimate and was doing so without making a production of the revision. The district attorney for the state, working in coordination with the federal prosecutor's office, determined that Mason's actions on the night of the incident were consistent with lawful self-defense and defense of others under Wyoming statute. The language was specific and clinical and took 4 paragraphs to say what could have been said in 1 sentence. But the conclusion was clear. Charges. No further proceedings. Holt called him to tell him. "It's done," she said, officially. "Okay," he said. A pause. "You could say something more than okay," she said. "Would you like me to say?" "Most people say thank you." "I wasn't charged with anything I did," Mason said. "I'm not sure what I'm thanking anyone for." Another pause. And this surprised him. Holt laughed. It was a short sound, not unkind. "Fair point," she said. "Take care of yourself, mister." Voss entered a federal guilty plea 7 weeks after his arrest. The plea agreement covered racketeering, narcotics distribution conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder in the first degree in the death of Ryan Donovan. He received 41 years without possibility of parole. He was 63 years old. At the sentencing hearing, which Mason did not attend, but which was covered in sufficient detail by the state news service that he read the account twice, Voss made a statement from the defense table. He said he had believed he was maintaining order in a county that needed a strong hand. He said the people of Black Pine had been safer under his watch than they would have been otherwise. He said several other things that the judge allowed him to finish before sentencing him. Mason read the account and set it down and didn't pick it up again. The thing about people like Voss, the thing that made them possible, that allowed them to build what he'd built over 22 years, was not the corruption itself. Corruption was simple. Corruption was just want exceeding restraint. What made Voss was the genuine belief underneath it, the real conviction that his version of order was worth the cost of everything else, that the end of the ledger justified every line above it. You couldn't argue with that. You couldn't deprogram it or reach it with evidence or change it by showing the damage it caused. The only thing you could do was stop it, physically, structurally, finally, was what the night had done. Not changed Voss. Stopped him. Mason folded the newspaper, put it in the recycling bin. Kane's trial was separate and took longer. He had not maintained his initial cooperation. The 30 minutes of unguarded confession had apparently been a crack in his composure that sealed back up once a lawyer was present. He entered a not guilty plea, withdrew it 8 weeks later when the prosecution's case was laid out in its full weight, and pled guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy charges. The compromise that his lawyer negotiated landed him at 28 years. He was 57. Donovan testified at both proceedings. Mason drove to Cheyenne for Kane's sentencing, specifically because she'd asked him to come. As a witness, he'd already given everything he had to give just to be there. He sat in the gallery 2 rows behind the prosecution table and watched her take the stand for the victim impact portion. She wore her uniform. It was the first time he'd seen her in it since the night of the crash. The uniform she'd had on then had been evidence, tagged and bagged in a federal facility somewhere. This one was clean and pressed, and she wore it with the specific posture of someone who had decided actively, consciously, what wearing it meant and what it didn't. She spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about Ryan. She talked about the work he'd done and what it had cost him and what it had cost her. She talked about 18 months of building a case alone, without support, without the institutional backing that law enforcement was supposed to provide. She talked about Ghost, which produced a sound from the gallery that Mason felt in his chest. She looked at Kane directly, not at the judge, not at her notes, at Kane, and said in a voice that was completely level and completely without performance, "You took everything he had left to give, and you used his trust to do it. That's not something I can forgive or that I want to." What I can do is make sure that everyone in this room understands exactly what you are. I just did. Kane did not look at her. He looked at the table in front of him for the 11 minutes she spoke, and he kept looking at it after she finished. The judge sentenced him 40 minutes later. Outside the courthouse, on the front steps in February cold that was sharp, but nothing like what Wyoming had shown them in January, Mason stood beside Donovan while she buttoned her coat. "Kay?" he said. She considered the question honestly, which he'd come to understand was something she always did. She didn't answer from reflex, she actually checked. "Yet," she said. "But closer," he nodded. "Ghost is in the truck," he said. "He's been in there for 3 hours, and he's annoyed about it." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. "Let's go get him," she said. Spring came late to Black Pine, the way it always did, reluctantly, in stages, with the occasional blizzard reminder that the season hadn't finished having opinions. By the time the county road was reliably passable, and the mud season had mostly resolved itself, 6 months had passed since the night on the mountain road. The cabin had been repaired. Dennis Hale had shown up that first Saturday with 4 men and a truck full of materials, and they'd worked through the day, replacing the door, reframing the window that had taken the shotgun blast, pulling the damaged drywall from the hallway, and replacing it with new board. They hadn't talked much. Mason wasn't good at the social version of shared labor, and the men Dennis brought seemed to understand this without it being said, but they'd stayed until the work was done and refused payment and left. The following Saturday, 2 of them came back to help with the roof sealant that had needed doing since October. It was not the start of a social life. Mason was not going to become the kind of man who went to cookouts or showed up at city council meetings or remembered birthdays with any reliability. But something had changed in the arithmetic of his relationship with Black Pine. Some variable had been revised, and the equation came out differently than it had for the previous 2 years. People looked at him differently, not with the specific reverence that he'd feared, and that would have been insufferable, not the way they'd look at a man they'd decided was a hero and needed to treat accordingly. More like the way you look at a person when you realize you'd been working from a wrong assumption, and the recalibration happens slowly in the accumulation of small moments. Dennis's wife started leaving a bag of produce from on Mason's porch when she had surplus. The pharmacist remembered Eli's name and asked about him when Mason came in. The school principal, who had previously been pleasant in the formal arm's-length way of someone who didn't quite know what to make of a single father who didn't volunteer for things, stopped Mason in the parking lot one morning and said, with apparent genuine feeling, "Your son is remarkable." Mason had said, "I know," and nothing else, and the principal hadn't seemed to mind. The conversation with Eli happened in March. One conversation, it was never going to be one conversation, and Mason had known that going in. It was a series of them, starting with the morning after the night itself and continuing in pieces through the winter, each piece covering whatever territory Eli's questions reached that day. The March conversation was the one that mattered most. They were in the truck, coming back from Eli's school a Wednesday, mid-afternoon. Yes, he'd the light, doing something particular with the snow on the mountains that Eli had been looking at through the window for the last 10 minutes. "Did my mom know?" Eli said. Mason looked at him, then back at the road. "What I'd done. What I was trained to do." "Yes," Mason said. She knew everything. Was she okay with it? A pause. The road curved. The mountains went on being the mountains. She wasn't always, Mason said. Early on, she struggled with it. The deployments, the not knowing. He kept his eyes on the road, but she understood why I did it, and she trusted me to come back. Another pause. "I always did." Eli was quiet. "Until you stopped," he said. An accusation. Just the shape of the thing as he understood it. "Until I stopped," Mason agreed. "Because of her?" "Because of you," Mason said. "Because of you both. Because I wanted—" He stopped and started again. "You can do a job for the right reasons and still reach a point where the right reasons have changed. She was sick and I needed to be home and the equation was different." He glanced at Eli. "That's not complicated. It's just what happens when what matters most becomes clear." Eli looked out the window again. "Do you miss it?" Honest answer. He owed the boy honest answers. "Some of it," he said. "The people, the clarity of it. Having a mission that was defined. A beat, but not more than I'm glad I got out." "Why?" Because if I hadn't gotten out, I wouldn't have been here. If I hadn't been here, you'd have been alone that night. Eli sat with this for a while. The truck moved through the valley, and the mountains held their position on all sides, and the afternoon light went on doing its thing with the snow. I'm glad you were here too, Eli said. Quietly, matter-of-factly, the way children sometimes say the most important things. Mason kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, he said. Me too. Donovan joined the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation in April. The appointment came after a recruitment process that Briggs had apparently initiated by making a phone call to the right person. At the right moment, Mason learned this later, secondhand, through Holt, who mentioned it in the context of something else entirely, which was how he suspected Briggs had intended it. Donovan herself didn't mention Briggs's involvement when she told Mason about the appointment. She told him in the driveway of his cabin on a Saturday afternoon, standing beside her vehicle with her coat unzipped because the April weather had turned genuinely warm. For the first time all year, she said it the same way she said most things, directly, without prelude. I got the position, she said, the DCI job, yes. When do you start? 3 weeks, he looked at her. She was different from the woman he'd pulled out of a frozen creek in January, not in the fundamental ways. Not in the parts that had been there all along, but in some surface quality that was difficult to name precisely. Less like someone carrying a weight they've decided to carry, and more like someone who had put the weight down, not forgotten it, but put it down, and found that their posture changed when they did. That's good, he said. I know, she looked at the cabin. At the repaired door, the new window frame, the work that had been done. Mason. He waited. I want to bring Ghost to the ceremony. When I'm sworn in, a beat. He's your dog, Mason said. He's been your dog since you were in that cruiser. That's not, she stopped. Looked at him directly. That's not actually true. He chose you, the same way you chose him. That's not nothing. Mason looked at Ghost, who was sitting in the driveway, between them with his head turning from one person to the other, following the conversation with the particular intelligence of an animal that understood more of human exchange than was strictly comfortable to acknowledge. He can be at the ceremony, Mason said. We'll both be there. Something moved in her face. Okay, she said. You can figure out the custody arrangement, he said. I want liberal visitation. She looked at him for a second. Finally, completely, she smiled, not the adjacent to a smile that he'd seen on the courthouse steps, but the actual thing which changed her face in a way that he noticed and filed somewhere he didn't particularly examine. Done, she said. The swearing-in ceremony was on the second Thursday in May. It was a small affair, a conference room in the DCI regional office in Casper, maybe 30 people, agency personnel, and a few invited guests. Briggs was there, standing at the back with his too-thin coat and his wire-rimmed glasses, looking like a man who had arranged to be in the room without technically being the reason for it. Holt was there too, which surprised Mason. Didn't know you'd be here, he said, when he found her near the coffee table. Donovan specifically asked, Holt said. Something about wanting the people who'd seen the worst of it to also see this. Mason looked at her. That sounds like her, he said. Eli stood beside Mason through the ceremony in the collared shirt that he'd complained about for 20 minutes on the drive down and was now wearing without complaint, because the situation had apparently communicated its own formality to him. Sat at Mason's left side, leash slack, looking at Donovan at the front of the room with an attention that didn't waver. Yet, the administrator who conducted the swearing-in was a woman with the careful efficiency of someone who understood ceremony and didn't waste it. She read the oath with the appropriate gravity, and Donovan repeated it, left hand at her side, right hand raised, the shoulder that had been dislocated, now carrying the motion without visible difficulty. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office. It was a short ceremony. Most of the important ones are. Afterward, when the room had loosened into conversation and bad coffee, and the ambient noise of people who'd done a difficult thing and were relieved to be past it, Donovan found Mason by the window. She crouched down and put her hands on Ghost's face. The dog pressed into her palms and closed his eyes, and she held him there for a moment. Then she stood up. Ryan would have liked you, she said. Mason wasn't sure what to do with that. He tried 3 different responses in his head and discarded all of them. I would have liked him, he said finally. She nodded. Looked out the window at the parking lot, at the May sky above Casper, which was the kind of blue that only exists in Wyoming in the spring, a specific, uncompromising blue that doesn't occur at lower altitudes. "I'm buying the house in Black Pine," she said. He looked at her. "The one on Keller Road," she said. "It's been empty since the Martins moved to Arizona. It needs work." But she stopped. "I know the area. What it is in winter. And Eli's school is 15 minutes from it." She said the last part without emphasis, just as information. But they both understood what the information contained. "It's a good road," Mason said. "I know." She looked at him sideways. "You can come over and fix things. You seem to like fixing things." "I fix things when they need fixing," he said. "Not as a personality trait." "Sure," she said, with a tone that meant she had formed an opinion about that, and was choosing not to share it. Eli appeared at Mason's elbow. "Can we get food?" he said. "I'm starving, and the coffee table only had little crackers." Donovan looked down at him. "There's a diner 2 blocks over. They have good pie." Eli looked up at Mason. "Can we?" Mason looked at Donovan, at Eli, at Ghost, who was already pointing toward the door with the forward-leaning attention of a dog who'd heard the word diner before and had associated it with positive outcomes. Mason said, "Let's go." They stayed at the diner for 2 hours. Eli had the cheeseburger and the pie, which was a quantity of food that Mason observed with the quiet wonder of a parent watching a 7-year-old's metabolism operate at full capacity. Donovan had coffee and eggs, and corrected Eli's incorrect understanding of how the state investigative division worked versus how the county sheriff's system worked, which devolved into a 20-minute explanation of jurisdictional law that Eli followed with the specific focused interest he gave to things he genuinely wanted to understand. Mason had the coffee and a club sandwich and watched the two of them talk. Ghost was outside, tied to the bike rack with Eli's belt, because the diner wasn't dog-friendly, visible through the window, sitting in the Macene sun with his eyes half closed and his face turned up to the light. At some point, Eli said something that made Donovan laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised even her. "No," and she put her hand over her mouth and shook her head, and Eli looked enormously pleased with himself. Mason looked at his coffee cup. He was not a man who mapped futures. Hoaxtions. He'd stopped doing that somewhere in the middle of his 3rd deployment, when he'd understood that the future was a place you arrived at, not a place you planned toward. What you planned was the next step, and then the step after that, and you did each one as well as you could with the information you had and the capability you'd built and the people you had beside you. The next step was finishing the coffee. After that, it was the drive home, north on the highway, with the mountains coming into view, and Eli probably asleep in the back seat within 20 minutes and Ghost with his nose out the window, regardless of the temperature. After that, there was a property that needed work on the eastern fence line, and a boy who needed help with his reading comprehension, and a dog who needed a longer run than he'd had since before the January storm. After that, he didn't know. That was fine. He'd learned not to need to know. What he knew was this: the cabin on the mountain road was not the same structure it had been in January, not just the repaired door and the new window, but in some quality that wasn't architectural. Something had been stripped from it that night, and something else had come in to take up the space. Better, not worse, just different, more honest. The way places sometimes get after the thing they were hiding around finally surfaces. He'd been hiding something too. Not from dishonesty, from exhaustion. From the particular tiredness of being a thing that other people need you to be, and not having the bandwidth left to be the rest of it. 2 years of quiet and distance, and the deliberate cultivation of smallness. 2 years of Mason Rourke, harmless neighbor, rather than the full and complicated and not entirely comfortable thing that he actually was. The night in January had ended that. Not ended it badly, just ended it. He was still the man who made eggs for his son and fixed fences and drove carefully on icy roads. He was also the man who'd crossed 40 feet of open ground toward a flare gun in a blizzard and understood the arithmetic of a stairwell at 6 feet and spent 11 years running missions that he still wasn't going to discuss at dinner. Both things, the same man. And Black Pine, Wyoming knew it now and had collectively decided that this was acceptable information. He paid the check. Eli protested the departure on the grounds that there was still pie available as a concept, even if not on the table in front of him, and Donovan told him that pie would still exist the next time, which was a promise that Eli accepted as legally binding. They walked out into the May afternoon together, Donovan, Mason, Eli, and Ghost, who had been retrieved from the bike rack and was now conducting a thorough investigation of the diner's front sidewalk. The blue Wyoming sky went on above them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. Saturday, Donovan said at the vehicles. What about it? I'm going to look at the Keller Roadhouse. The realtor has a key. She looked at him. Eli could come. He'd have opinions. He'd have 30 opinions, Mason said. That's what I want. Eli had heard his name and turned. What about Saturday? Officer Donovan's looking at a house, Mason said. Eli looked at Donovan with immediate focus. Is it near our house? About 2 miles, she said. Does it have a yard? I think so. He considered this with appropriate seriousness. Ghost needs space to run, he said. You should check the yard. I will, she said. That's why I want you there. You know his requirements. Eli nodded, satisfied. He turned back to the truck and climbed in, pulling the door shut and climbed him with the shut behind the of someone who had just been given a professional responsibility. Mason looked at Donovan. She looked back. 2 miles is close, he said. She said, that's the point. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, intervened. Then he got in the truck. In the rearview mirror, pulling out of the parking lot, he saw her standing by her own vehicle, looking at her phone, the May light doing something particular with her hair. Ghost had his nose out the window. Eli was already most of the way to asleep. Mason pointed the truck north and drove. The mountains came up on all sides as they climbed back toward Black Pine. Same mountains they'd always been, vast and permanent and completely unconcerned with any of it. The highway was dry and clear, and the speed limit was 70, and he kept it there, cruise control on, both hands resting on the wheel. Eli fell asleep, fully somewhere around the county line. Ghost pulled his nose in from the window and settled with his chin on the door rest, watching the road go by with the quiet patience of an animal that had found its place in the world after a long time of not knowing where that was. Mason drove. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, ordinary specific his. A fence to fix, a boy to raise, a woman 2 miles down the road who'd decided Black Pine was worth staying for, a dog who had, against every reasonable expectation, learned to stop flinching at sirens. None of it was large or cinematic or the kind of thing that gets written into official records. All of it was what actually mattered. That was the thing Mason Rourke had spent 41 years in 2 wars and 1 Wyoming winter learning, and the thing he suspected most people spent their whole lives reaching toward without quite arriving. The most important mission you will ever run is the one happening in the room where the people you love are sleeping. So